Thank you very much, Alessandro and the organizer for this invitation, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk about different topics we are doing in the lab that are all related to the physics of granular matter. So actually, granular matter, that is a large collection of particles are everywhere around us, from massive natural events like this rock avalanche or landslide shown in these pictures, to industrial flows. For instance, this is concrete flows, and even to biological systems where many processes involve the transport of particles like red blood cells, or here chloroplast, the particles that collect light in plants. And the difficulty to describe these systems is that there are many particles, and the particles are too small to be followed individually. We don't want to follow each particle, but to make a kind of continuous description. But on the other hand, we are dealing with macroscopic particles. And so for these particles, temperature, the classical temperature is usually irrelevant, and the interaction between particles are highly dissipative. So the classical tools of statistical physics are not well suited to describe this kind of materials. So to get progress, people have, for the last 20 years, focused on a kind of ideal particulate systems we call dry granular flows. That is a collection of identical sphere, macroscopic sphere with no temperature, that interact only through hard contact, okay? Friction, for instance, or collisions. And the typical configuration is this one. So you have a layer of grains between two plates, and you apply a confining pressure on this layer, so the two plates are free to move. And then you shear the two plates, and you ask, for instance, what is the shear rate you have to apply in order to have a given shear stress or the opposite. And in these ideal systems, since there is no internal stress scale, the particles are infinitely hard, dimensional analysis can help us and tells us that the shear stress in order to shear this layer has to be proportional to the confining stress. That is, you have a kind of frictional behavior with a friction coefficient that depends on a unique dimensionless parameter here. And also the packing fraction, when you shear, the packing fraction also is a single function of this dimensionless number. And how this friction and packing fraction vary with the shear rate is given here. And what is important is that there is a transition between no flow and flow. As you decrease the shear rate here, there is a minimal friction coefficient below which no flow is possible. And also, as you decrease the shear rate, there is a maximal packing fraction above which no flow is possible. And this critical point is called the jamming transition. So today, most research is devoted to understand the microscopic mechanisms around this jamming transition. But at least with this kind of frictional rheology, we can do fluid mechanics with this kind of strange liquid. And we can implement this in code. And I just show you a very recent movie made by computer scientists at INRIA to give you an idea how far now the description, at least at the macroscopic point of view, how far this description of granular materials have been pushed. So you see, this is not there is no trick here. This is really a fluid mechanic code with this kind of frictional rheology. And well, at least from a practical point of view, from a macroscopic point of view, this is pretty nice. So in this talk, we are going to go beyond these ideal granular materials, and we are going to go to a bit dirty systems more realistic. And what we are going to see is that adding a fluid between the grains, or adding small short-range interaction between the particles, or sometimes even adding agitation between the particles at the particles level, can completely change the behavior of these granular flows, especially close to this jamming transition. So there will be three parts in the talk like this. So in the first part of the talk, we are going to mix grains and a fluid, and see that this has a strong influence on the transient response of a granular mixture like this, as observed, for instance, when an solid object hits a granular target. And this first part of the talk is the work done by John Jerome during his postdoc in collaboration with Nicolas van den Berg at the IRFE labs. So of course, impact in this kind of granular mixture has a lot of application in ballistics, civil engineering, or astrophysics. There have been many studies, and these studies have all revealed a very rich phenomenology and a wide range of behavior depending on the system considered. For instance, in dry granular materials, when you threw an object inside this, you get in the end a nice crater that is reminiscent to the crater observed in planets due to asteroids. Meteorites, for instance, impact. On the other hand, people have also made experiments with fine powders. So it's still grains, but much smaller in size, and dry powders. And in this case, the behavior was completely different. During the impact, the medium completely liquefied. So it's more like a liquid-like response that was observed. And more recently, there have been experiments on completely different systems. This is a suspension, so a mixture of grains and liquid, but of complex fluids, and in particular cornstarch suspensions. I don't know if you know this, but I've bring some example here. And in this case, the response is completely the opposite. That is, the medium really solidified during the impact. So you can run on a pool made of this kind of shear, what we call shear thickening liquids, pool of cornstarch. And so you see very different behavior with always the same kind of systems, grains mixed with a gas or liquids. And you can ask the question whether it comes from different kind of rheology, or is there an underlying mechanisms that can explain all these different phenomena in a unifying framework. So in order to better understand this, what we have done is not to use complex suspensions that we don't really understand what's going on here, or powders, but we use a very simple suspensions made with macroscopic glass beads, so it's glass bead between 0.1 and 1 millimeter, that we put in a Newtonian liquid. And we especially take care about the control of the initial packing fraction of the soil. So the protocol is the following. You just initially you fluidize, you put your particles in a tank, liquid tank, you fluidize everything, and you cut the fluidization, and so now everything is closed, and the particles settle down. And when they settle down under gravity, they reach what we call a loose state, the loose sediment. And this loose sediment, we can compact it nicely by gently tap on the container. And so we can change by 5% the packing fraction of the initial granular suspensions. And then we remove the excess liquid above the suspensions, and we threw the object inside this medium. So a very simple protocol where you control essentially the diameter of the particles and the viscosity of your liquid, and also, of course, the velocity of the impactor, its density, its size. So I show you two extreme cases, the impact in a loose sediment and the impact in a dense sediment. So that's a first movie taken with a fast camera. So you will see the impact here on a sediment that is solid but loose. So I show you the movie. And so what you see here is that as soon as the object impacts these very dense granular materials, which is at 56%, everything liquefied, and you see this nice liquid jet full of particles. So everything happens as if you just eat a liquid, like a pool of milk, for instance. And what is surprising is that you give some tap on this system, so you compact it from, let's say, 56% to 60%, so a very small change of packing fraction. And you have this kind of response now. You see a completely different response just by changing a little bit the initial packing fraction. So this really illustrated the dramatic effect you can have when you mix grains and fluids with the granular materials like this, close to this critical packing fraction. And so how can we explain this phenomenon? Well, we just have to go back to Reynolds, so the same Reynolds as the Reynolds number in fluid mechanics. And he made these simple experiments that I've bring here, and he showed the first that a granular materials that is prepared in a dense way, when you deform it, actually it expands. It increases its volume. And this is what's called Reynolds dilatancy. And he showed this in front of Maxwell's and all the great physicists of this time, who were quite surprised. But I'm sure you are not going as surprised as them, but a century later. But at least this is the Reynolds experiment. So this is a bottle full of sand and full of water. And the water goes up to this level. I don't know if everybody see the level here of the water. And what Reynolds did is he pressed the bottle like this. And what was surprising is that the level of the water go down, okay? Which is a clear signature of the fact that the volume has increased when I have pressed, okay? So you can come after to make the experiments to see that there is no trick. And so now you can imagine that you can understand the mechanism why there is this transition, sharp transition during the impact. When you are above a critical packing fraction, above the critical packing fraction I've mentioned initially, when the impactor arrives, the materials has to deform. And so because we are above the critical packing fraction, it has to dilate. But since it's full of liquid, it means that the size of the pore, the volume increase here. And so the liquid has to be sucked in the pores. So it means that there is a strong negative liquid pressure that builds between the particles. And so this negative pressure presses the particles together. And we have seen that granular materials, it's a kind of a friction. It's like solid friction. The harder you press the system, the higher it's hard to deform it. So it seems that during the impact, you increase the strength of your materials. Okay? And now if you prepare your sample below this critical packing fraction, this is simply the opposite. Now when you deform the granular materials, it wants to compact instead of dilate. And since, again, it's full of liquid, now the liquid has to expel. And so you build up a positive pore pressure. And this positive pore pressure can be enough to balance the initial weight of the grains, to pull the grains apart and completely liquefy the medium. And so we have validated these mechanisms by making direct measurements of this pore pressure. So it's not very difficult. You just connect an hydrophone to a thin tube, ended with a very thin grid that is smaller than the size of the grains. So it's a kind of a membrane, and you measure only the pressure of the liquid phase, not of the grains. And when you do this, what you see is what you expect from these mechanisms. In the dense case, as during the impact, in the milliseconds of the impact, a huge pressure drops between the particles developed, and the amplitude of these pressure drops can be close to the atmospheres. I mean, it's really like you are doing void between the particles. On the other hand, when you are in the loose case, this is the opposite. During the impact, there is a positive pore pressure. So it's really the sign of the pore pressure and this coupling between the deformation of the granular matrix and the fluid flows that is important. So we can go a bit further and try to build a model of this. And we have to add two main ingredients. The first one is the Reynolds dilatancy, the fact that when you shear slowly a granular materials, transiently it will either dilate or contract depending on the initial preparation. So a very simple constitutive law that you can write is a kind of linear response between the dilatation and the distance from the critical point. So that's just a closure relation here. And you have to write how the flow of the liquid inside your porous media apply a stress. And so this is a well-known law that is called the Darcy law. It's a kind of a low Reynolds number viscous law, a viscous drag, saying that the difference of velocity between the fluids and the particles is simply proportional to the gradient of the fluid pressure. And here you have two parameters, here the fluid viscosity, and here the permeability of your granular porous medium, let's say, that is related to the size of the grains to the square. And when you mix this with the mass conservation for both the liquids and the particles, you simply end up with a kind of a Poisson equation for the pressure of the fluids with a source term here that depends on all the parameters that you have introduced in the problem. The viscosity, the size of the grains, the shear rate, so the speed of the impactors, and the distance to the critical point. And you can write a scaling equation for this pore pressure. So just to illustrate what parameters are important, you see that the main parameters is given by this ratio of the fluid viscosity to the permeability, which is proportional, as I said, to the d to the power square. And so it means that these parameters control the strength of the fluids that the fluids apply on the grains. So here I've just made 3 movies at the same impact conditions, at the same initial preparation packing fraction. But you see that I have three different cases. Here it's small particles in water. Here it's larger particles still in water. So I decrease strongly this parameter. And now I recover the initial value of this by taking the same particles but increasing the viscosity 100 times. And you are going to see in parallel all the movie here. This is what I wanted to show here. And what you see clearly is that the two extreme cases, although the size of the particles and the viscosity of the liquids are different, since this parameter is the same as the same response, whereas here, of course, the pore pressure has much less strength to resist to the impact. And so we can now make a full model of a prediction for the penetration of the spheres. So this is very simple physics. We just write the Newton's law for the objects here. And the main force that resists to the penetration inside the granular materials is a friction law, as I said at the beginning. And all the strength of these granular materials is given by the pressure applied to the grains. And the pressure, I take the pore pressure, the fluid pressure, given by the previous scaling. And using simple algebra here, you end up with a prediction, a simple ODE for the penetration of your objects. So we can compare now quantitatively by changing all the parameters of the situation, the velocity of the impactors, the size of your object, the diameter of the grains, and also the viscosity of the liquid. And here you have, for instance, the acceleration, the deceleration during the impact as a function of different parameters, as a function of the distance to the jamming point. And also here the pore pressure that we have measured dynamically with our setup. And the main things to see is that using the prediction of the model, you can gather at least rather well the experimental data on the prediction of the model. So it means what? It means that if actually we see that simply taking into account this coupling between the dye latency, which is a peculiar properties of granular materials, and the coupling with the liquid flows inside this porous media is enough to actually predict all the different situations I've shown initially. There are two main parameters in this situation. One is the magnitude of this fluid pressure compared to the initial pressure between the grains due to their gravity. And if the fluid pressure is above this pressure due to gravity, then the fluid dominates the process. And then if the fluid dominates the process, what matters is to know whether you are above or below the critical packing fraction. And of course, now if the fluid pressure is very small compared to the initial pressure on the grains due to gravity, then you can forget about the fluids between the grains. And what you observe is the classical patterns of impact observed, for instance, on a planet where you see this kind of craters here. So this is for what we see that we can reproduce the behavior of powders or dry granular materials. And here, this looks like a little bit the cornstarch situation, the kind of solidification during impact. But is it really the same? So here I have a movie taken from YouTube that is a bit well, I just ran the movie, but just to show you the typical dynamics, how the people run on this kind of pool of cornstarch. And you see that it seems to be a bit similar to what I've talked, but there is a major difference. And the major difference is here. You see, they said don't sink, and actually they should have written don't stop moving, okay? Because on this kind of materials, which are shear thickening, there is a critical speed or critical stress below which the medium is liquid, and a critical stress above which it is solid. And this is very different from the suspensions I have talked before, the ideal suspensions I have talked, where there is no stress scale in the problem. I mean, what matters is whether you are above or below the critical packing fraction, but you are not going to change this with the stress or with the speed. So it seems that these kind of systems, which are made of very small grains, this is starch grains, 10 microns in diameter, it seems that these grains also, although under the microscope they look like sand grains, they have something special. And for a very long time, people have tried to understand how does it work, I mean, these kind of systems. So I also bring this, the cornstarch so you can play with this, but you really see that so it's the same mixture. If I move this slowly, it's, I can move this like in milk, and it's really only when I hit this that it's solidified. Okay, so there is a kind of velocity scale or stress scale inside this medium. So as I said, for long it was a puzzle, but recently there have been a mechanism. A mechanism has been proposed by scientists from New York, from the NYU and the Levish Institute, and the idea was that the key idea was that these grains possess a short-range repulsive force around the particles. So there is now a new force scale or stress scale. Okay, you can build a stress by dividing this force by the grain's diameter to the square. And so the idea is that at low velocity or at low stress, the external stress can be below the critical stress needed to put the particles in contact. And so everything happens as if the particles slip between each other, and as if there was no friction between the particles. But now if you increase the external stress or the external speed, then you can overcome this repulsive force, and now the particles say, oh, we are in contact, so we have solid friction, and so now it's a frictional suspensions. So the idea is that shear thickening suspensions possess this kind of short-range repulsive force that gives rise to a frictionless frictional transition between two states like this. And why this is dramatic, to be frictionless or to be frictional? It's dramatic because actually the critical packing fraction I've talked at the beginning, I've mentioned at the beginning of the talk, this critical packing fraction above which no continuous flow is possible, depends on the microscopic friction between the particles. For frictionless particles, this critical packing fraction is about 64%. Okay? But as soon as you add friction between the particles, this critical packing fraction drops to about, it's not a lot, it's to about 58%. So now if there is this short-range repulsive force, it means that depending on your external stress, you have a suspension that is either very far from the jamming point, but when you increase the stress, the suspension gets closer to the jamming point. And so it means that increasing stress brings the suspension closer to jamming. And so that's the main ingredient. So in the lab, what we have tried to do is to test these mechanisms by measuring this microscopic friction coefficient in the shear thickening suspensions. And the trick we use is to not to make a microscopic measurements, but to use a macroscopic signature of the friction between particles. And these macroscopic signatures, this is the avalanche angle of the granular materials. We all know that granular materials build cone with a well-defined angle. And actually, this is because under gravity, the ratio of the shear stress to the normal stress, which is the friction coefficient, is simply given by tangent the inclinations of the free surface. And so measuring the angle of an avalanche, it's like measuring the critical friction coefficient of your suspensions. And it turns out that the critical friction coefficient of granular materials depends on the microscopic friction between the particles. For for typical friction coefficient between particles, you get a pile angle that is, let's say, about 20, 25 degrees. But now, if you decrease the friction between the particles, and especially when there is no friction at all between the particles, this angle, avalanche angle dramatically drops and remains finite at about, let's say, 5 degrees. So an assembly of frictionless particles still have an avalanche angle, but this avalanche angle is about 5 degrees instead of being 20 degrees. So now we did the experiment. So we put our shear thickening suspensions, or not shear thickening suspension, inside a rotating drum full of liquids, and you slowly rotate the drum, and you measure simply the steady angle of the free surface during the steady avalanche. And also what is interesting with this configuration is that the avalanche occurs only on the few first layer of particles at the top of the piles, which means that actually what you are measuring by measuring this avalanche angle is really the friction between the particles at very, very low confining stress and under a quasi-static sliding. Okay, so at very low sliding velocities. So what were the results? I mean, we compare a classical suspensions of macroscopic beads that is not shear thickenings. And in this case, we recover the classical avalanche angle of 25 degrees. Okay, so typical avalanche angle for frictional particles. But then when we use these starch suspensions of a small starch particle inside the rotating drums, the surprise was to see that it continuously flows, but at these very, very low angles, meaning that the particles the friction between particles almost vanish in these systems. So it seems that really there is a connection between the microscopic friction and the rheological behavior of the suspensions. And we went further as well. We use a system where you can control the repulsive force because starch particles, the repulsive force of starch particles is very poorly controllable and understood. But we use a suspension of silica beads in ionic liquids, of a solution of salts, for instance. And in this case, the silica particles get charged, and you have an electric double layer around the particles with a repulsive force that decays almost exponentially, and you can change the range of your repulsive force just by changing the amount of salt inside your solution. So it's very easy with this system to control the magnitude and the range of the repulsive forces. And what you observe is that when you put these suspensions in pure water, where the repulsive force has a long range, you have a medium with no friction. So it flows without any friction with this very low avalanche angle. And as you increase the salt concentration, suddenly you have a transition from a frictionless systems to a frictional system with friction coefficient above between 20 and 30 degrees. And what is interesting is that the transition here occurs when the range of the repulsive force is of the order of the roughness of the silica particles. And here when I talk about roughness, I talk about roughness of the order of the nanometers. So we see that nanometers features at the surface of these particles can have a huge impact on the macroscopic response of flow response of these suspensions. And you can see this by tuning the range of the repulsive force across these microscopic length scales. And so at the same time, at the same time we made rheological measurements, and it turns out that the systems that possess this repulsive force indeed is shear thickening, but when you suppress the repulsive force, you suppress the shear thickening behavior. So the connection between the macroscopic features and the macroscopic ones is pretty clear here. And there have been completely different kind of experiments, but that reach the same conclusion here at ENS and also at ESPCI, where they use like an original atomic force machine to directly measure these microscopic friction coefficients. And they reach the same conclusion, that is, at low confining stress, these particles in shear thickening suspensions behave as if there is no friction. But when you press them more, then a coefficient of friction appears. Okay? So that's so now we can understand why, how does it work, the impact in shear thickening suspensions. Of course, if you prepare, as I prepare here my suspensions, here initially, the packing fraction, now you can, when you increase the stress, you can be in these forbidden regions where in order to flow, you have to dilate. And since here the particles are very small, the Darcy pressure generated by this dilation is huge and is large enough to sustain the weight of persons as we see. So just to conclude this first two parts, so we see that microscopic effects here, friction, the balance between friction and short-range repulsive force at the very small scale, or transient fluid grains coupling can strongly modify the flow of dense suspensions. So this opens several questions and an interesting field. For instance, we can ask whether you have new instabilities with this kind of ingredients. And this is a movie where you see a cornstarch layer flowing under an inclined plane, and you see all these very intriguing wave patterns here. Also, you can have this kind of behavior, very strange. This is a movie by Blum-Metzger. And so he just take rapidly a spoon of cornstarch in a container and heat it, and suddenly it's like heating liquefied medium, suddenly. So it's like a phase transition, but given by vibration, like this. And this kind of idea can be used to control the flow properties of a suspensions by, for instance, adding controlled vibration with acoustic waves, where you can disconnect the networks, the solid networks between the grain, disconnect the friction alternatively, and so having a kind of suspensions where the viscosity drops by a huge amount, just externally controlled. With here a loudspeaker. So it was nice work in the Itai Cohen group recently. So it's time now to go to the last part of my talk. So we are going to shift completely the context, and we are going to talk about active granular materials in the context of plant cells. So this is a completely different subject, but still related to granular materials. You are going to see. This is the problem of how plants detect gravity. We all know that plants can respond to many different physical signals as light or wind or whatever. Gravity is a very important cue, external cue for plants as well, because from the beginning when you have a seed deep in the ground, the seed must know where to grow, where is the down and where is the up, where the roots has to go and where the shoot has to grow in order to find the light. So knowing the vertical axis is very important at the beginning of the development, but also all along the life. Of course, a plant has to grow straight. I mean, if it grows not inclined, it just fall apart. So it seems to us obvious that we saw all the plants like a stick, a very straight stick, but it's not that obvious. And actually, here, it's a forest in Poland where people have, in young trees, just inclined them initially. So they put the trees and they just incline it like this. And 10 years, several decades later, you see this kind of shape. This is the trees trying to recover the vertical direction. Okay. So that's a very long experiment. You can make a lab experiments with much faster growing plants. And this is the experiment here done by Bastien at MSC and Clermont-Ferrand a few years ago. This is with Arabidopsis thaliana, which is the drosophile of plant scientists. And so here the movie is accelerated 6,000 times, but you see this very nice reaction of the plants when you put the plants horizontally like this. And so what I'm going to talk now is a work done with Hugo Chauvet, Antoine Beru, and Olivier Poliquin, and in collaboration with Valérie Leguet and Bruno Mouliat at the laboratory PIAF INRA in Clermont-Ferrand. And actually, we get interested in this problem because it's well known that the center of gravity in all plants, from small shoots to trees, occurs in specific cells. And in these cells, you can find tiny starch grains. So we recover the starch grains, starch particles. And these starch particles are denser than the surrounding cytoplasm. So they sediment toward the bottom of the cells. And this gives the direction of gravity. And there have been many experiments, a genetic one, for instance, that prove that these little grains that are called statolites are needed for the plants to detect gravity. And so the whole pathway is the following. So there is first statolite sedimentation. Then there is a phase of sensing. The cells sense the statolites. And then after, there is a redistribution of hormone, growth hormone within the plants, which means that now some parts of the plants will grow faster than other parts. And this results in this kind of bending. Okay? So there are still many questions, and especially for the sensing phase. That is not known. Especially, I mean, is this sensor a force sensor? Is this sensor a position sensor? And why the plants use granular materials to detect an inclination is not clear at all. So what we have done is to try to make macroscopic measurements of the response of plants. So this is what I call here, there is a movie. There should be a movie. Do you see something moving? Or? Yeah. So this is small wheat shoot, and you can incline the shoots and just measure the response of the plants. Okay, so that's very simple experiments to incline different inclinations. And when you do this, you can measure the response of the plants, which is the speed of the bending. And you can do this for different initial inclinations. So this is what I show here. So here, you see the response is very noisy. So this is the speed of the response as a function of the initial tilt angle of the shoot. And what you see is that there is an optimum, which is 90 degrees, where the speed is the fastest, and then it goes down. So you have a kind of sine law like this. Okay? And the sine law was already seen, and it was interpreted as a force sensor. The idea was if the plants measure the weight of the grains, well, the projection of the weight to the lateral side of the cell is simply mg times sinus theta. Okay? So if this is a force sensor, it seems obvious to have a kind of sine theta response for this sensor. So what we have done is to try to see whether it was the real explanation by not only change the inclination theta, but also change the magnitude of the gravity, okay, to see whether we have really a mg sine theta response. And so to do this, we use a rotating tables. So we add to the Earth's gravity centrifugal forces. And so we can, the combination of these two vectors give an effective gravity. And so by changing the radius here or the speed of rotation, we change the magnitude of the effective gravity. And it really works. I mean, here, this is the final inclination of the plants in this setup. And you see that the plants is always, in the end, aligned with the local direction of this effective gravity. So, of course, there is this equivalence between gravity and acceleration for the plants also. And the surprise was when we did this experiment. So we did the same experiments by increasing almost a factor 3 the intensity of the gravity, and all the points collapse on the same curve as before. So it seems that it's really an inclination sensor, but not at all a force sensor. And we checked this on other species, and the response was always the same. The response was completely independent to the effective gravity. So it seems that the sensor of gravity in plants, which use these granular materials, is not at all a force sensor, but a position sensor. And this is very different from the sensor of gravity of vertebrates like us, which also use tiny stones called otolite in a gels. And when you incline the head, you have a force applied on these otolites that deforms the hair cells. But in this case, this is really the force, the deformation that is measured. So it means that we cannot discriminate us between an inclination and an acceleration. We really measure the product of g to sinus theta, at least this sensor, because we have many other sensors as well. But the plant here is not a force sensor, it's a position sensor. And from a granular point of view, it poses a problem, because if it's a position sensor, it means that the grains has to move whatever the inclination of the cells. We've seen especially that in this curve, there is no threshold. Even for very low inclination, the plant's response, there is no threshold. But we have seen during the talk that the granular materials possess a threshold. If you put beads in these vials and you incline the systems, there is no motion below a critical angle, as we have seen. So we were very surprised that plants use granular materials to detect inclinations, knowing the properties of granular materials. So what we have done is trying to see really how inside the plant cells these grains moved. So this is the setup we use. We just cut thin slice of plant tissues, put this under the microscope, and the microscope, actually, we put the microscope horizontally. So now the stage of the microscope is in the vertical direction. So the stage of the microscope include the gravity vector. And so if you have a rotating stage here, you can really incline the cells of the plants under the microscope exactly as we incline or rotate the drums in our previous experiments. And in this picture, all the tiny, so this is cells, and all the tiny, the dark spots you see here are tiny granular heaps, okay? And the size of these particles is typically a few microns. So I just show you a movie and then I discuss later. So this is an inclination at 70 degrees. And I'm not sure you're going to see, but we do the movie after. All this black pile flows when you incline the plants. So I show it again. If you follow, for instance, this one, you see it's moving. This one is moving as well. So it's really a kind of a tiny submarine avalanche that we observe. And now we can track the individual heap. And in particular, what we track is the free surface of the heap to see how the angle of this heap changed during time when you suddenly apply a given inclinations to the cell. So we just developed an imaging tracking technique to get the free surface of the heap as a function of time. And this is the results when you average over many cells. This is the angle of inclination of this avalanche as a function of times here. And what you observe, and the main result, is that in the end, the free surface of the pile reached the horizontal. It's not like classical granular materials where in the end you get this final angle. In this case, you end up with a horizontal free surface here. And actually, in a log, semi-log representation in time, it's clearer. Here you see that initially there is a fast avalanche, like a granular avalanche, but then there is a fast avalanche towards a critical angle, and then a slow creeps of the medium towards horizontal. So there is this time evolution with two dynamics, and actually it's more like a liquid than a granular materials. These tiny grains, and so we understand with this that you can measure also very small angle because actually there is no critical angle in the end. So what's the main difference? And the main difference when you focus on a single heap, single cells, is the following. Here, this is on the left, a classical granular materials made with macroscopic grains. But here, this is the movie of the flow of the grains in the cells. This is accelerated, but still what you see is that there is this collective motions, avalanche collective motion, but there is also a strong agitation. And this strong agitation, of course, helps the grains to unjam and to jump across their neighbors. And it's like, you know, it's like agitating a sand heap externally. In the end, your heap is flat, okay, because you give enough energy to overcome the gravity barriers between the particles. So the question is this agitation enough to induce flow in our case? And where does this agitation come from? And I will finish with these two questions for the last 5 minutes. So, of course, you have two main hypotheses for this agitation. The first one, the obvious one, let's say, is simply the thermal agitation. We have small colloidal particles. They are submitted like any particles to the Brownian motions. And this could be the explanation for this agitation. And the other one is the fact that, of course, the particles are not immersed in a simple liquid, but this is the cells. This is the cytoplasm. So there are a lot of molecular motors, a lot of organs, of proteins, there are actins, there are myosin motors. So this could also create an agitation inside the fluid that itself agitate the statolites. So in order to know which mechanism is the good one, what we did, there was two strategies. One was to modify using mutants the cytoskeleton of the plants, but then you don't know what you change all the time when you do this. And the other strategy that we use is to use a model systems where there is only thermal motions and to compare both the biological systems to the physical systems. So this was the work done by Antoine Berru during his postdoc. And so he built artificial cells in PDMS here, using microbeads of silica particles from 0.5 microns to 5 microns. And this is immersed in water and sealed and put under the microscopes. And you imagine that this is much simpler to study than the real biological cells I've shown you before. Now you can really easily track the free surface of this heap. And in this system, the only dimensionless parameters that matters is very simple. This is the Peclet number. That is the balance between the gravity that push the particle downwards to the thermal diffusions that randomize the particles. And this is like the old Perrin law, except that here, I mean, the Peclet number is pretty high. I mean, we are pretty cold. The medium is always dense, but still the particle jiggle due to thermal motions. And what is interesting with these numbers is that since it's the ratio of the potential energy of the grains to the thermal energy, it varies as the diameter of the particles to the power 4. So by tuning a little bit the size of the particles, you really tune the thermal energy by a large amount. And so here is two typical situations with particles of 2 microns and here particles of 4.4 microns. And on the first movie, so I'm going to incline the cells. And you clearly see the agitation of the particles, and also you clearly see that everything goes pretty fast horizontally. Whereas here, for the larger particles, well, the agitation is much smaller first, and you almost see no motion for this low inclination angle. So by simply going from small particles to large particles, that is large thermal agitation to small thermal agitation, you go from a liquid-like behavior, the same kind of behavior we have observed with the biological systems, to a granular, more classical granular behavior. And this is all controlled by the Peclet number, and you can write a very simple Herring-like model for this problem that predicts pretty well the long time behavior creeping of these systems. And it works pretty well to write a kind of Kramers rate for predicting the time it takes for a Brownian granular heap to relax thermally. So now we can, the other advantage of these parameters is that you see that there is no viscosity. And that's magic because usually in microrheology, when you do microrheology in living systems, the main drawback is that you don't know at all the rheology of your fluids. But here, you see that you don't care about the viscosity or the rheology of your materials. It's a static it's a static measurement. It's not a dynamic one. So you can compare the biological systems to the physical system, although the fluids between the grains are completely different. And so this is what we have done, and I finished with these two slides. Here, this is the time it takes. So this is the physical systems, and this is the biological ones. And here in this axis, this is the time it takes for the avalanche to go to horizontal, to creep. And here, this is the thermal agitation, the inverse of the Peclet number. And of course, in the physical systems, the colder you are, the longer it takes to creep, and this is an exponential relationship. But what you see is that for the same temperature, the biological system creeps much faster, and actually it reaches 10,000 times faster than the analog, physical analog here. So it means that if you want to creep as fast with purely thermal systems, you have to increase by a factor 10 your temperature. So it's like having an apparent temperature in the biological systems 10 times larger than the real temperature. And the same conclusions can be reached if we measure on the static pile the vertical fluctuations and the gravity. This is exactly the same. The vertical fluctuations for the same temperature are an order of magnitude higher than the Brownian motions here. Okay? And of course, you can extract the statolites from the cells. That's what we have succeeded, and put the statolites in a simple liquid, and then you recover, of course, for this extracted statolite, the physical Brownian curve. So we can conclude that this is not thermal motions that helps these grains to flow. This is really something that is linked to the activity of the cytoskeleton between the particles. So it's really a kind of active granular materials here that we have, and that is really useful for the plants to detect gravity. So the fact that statolites behave like a liquid inclinometer is really thanks to this active agitation, and it's crucial to explain the remarkable sensitivity of plants to gravity. So of course the next step is to now visualize this activity of the cytoskeleton, and this is something that we have started with the group of Mio Morita in Nagoya, where you can track both the motion of the statolites and, for instance, the activity of actin filaments inside the cytoskeleton here. So I will, it's time for me to stop the talk. So I will just finish with this slide to acknowledge all the people who have worked in these different topics: the impact, shear thickening suspensions, and plants gravitropism. I did not mention Cécile Claveau, who did his PhD with Blunmetzger on shear thickening, and all the other people here. Okay, thank you very much.
So the fact that it's independent of gravity, so we could think of why is it useful for plants. So, and do you think that it's due to the fact? I mean, you said that it should be independent of the viscosity. So, is it due to the fact that you have changing weather and temperature and whatever, which you don't want to be sensitive to something which is very sensitive to temperature?
Well, so the fact that it's insensitive to the magnitude of the gravity, so the acceleration, for instance, is not very easy to see why for the plants. The only thing I can see is that the plants are always subjected to acceleration due to the short-time acceleration due to the wind or stuff like that. And so they don't want to mix this with an inclination. So that could be a reason, but I mean, it's completely speculative for this. But I really don't know why these systems. Yeah.
Because otherwise you could say it should use a second liquid, more dense liquid instead of a granular system. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I know. But then if you use a second liquid, it has not to mixed. So it's not that obvious because you need to add a strong surface tension between the particles. At that size, I'm not sure it's that easy if you have a surface tension. Otherwise, it's mixed. So maybe that's why it's better to have solid particles that do not disaggregate. And also, these particles are very useful for the plants itself. I mean, these particles produce all the starch, which is the the reserve of energy of the plants. So I mean, it could be a bypass. I mean, it could be a second use of something that is there in the cells.
When you blender into quicksand, what should you do?
When you what?
When you blender into quicksand,
yeah.
Should you run or swim?
When you are in a quicksand, actually, especially close to the Mont Saint-Michel, I've discussed with a guide there. This is a serious question because sometimes, I mean, what happens is that people sink, but you don't sink completely because of the Archimedes forces. You just sink half, but then you cannot go out because you just, due to this sucking effect, you cannot escape. And I mean, if people try to pull you, they just kill you. I mean, it's too strong. So what they do is that they call the firemen. So the firemen, but it's full of water, but they call the firemen. And they comes with their high pressure, I don't know the name, lance à incendie. And they put the high pressure water inside the sand and just turn on the pressure. And it's just liquefy everything, and now you can get. Before you have no chance to escape. No, because it's not cornstarch. So even if you can run, you will sink.
If you just lie down and try to swim?
No, you can. It doesn't work. At least.
Time for another question. Actually, I maybe have one. Mm-hmm. You show at a certain point that the plant can change the shape to control or contract the gravity, and you said that it was a migration of hormones that makes a sort of differential growth. But in that case, I would not expect this kind of very sharp shape like a 90 degrees.
Yeah. So the angle comes from the fact that actually growth is not everywhere along the stem, but is localized. And this sharp angle you've seen, actually, it's the limit between growth and not growth. Okay. I mean, there is a part of the plant that no longer grows at all. And if there is no longer growth, there is no longer bending also.
Okay. And it's always active, even if it is no growth, it's still active with all the detection of gravity.
No, it cannot respond to gravity when there is no growth. It does not respond. Yeah.
Okay. If there are another question, we can thank you all again, and thank you very much.
Thank you. It's okay.